Blackstone Publishing presents Mindfulness for Warriors, Empowering First Responders to Reduce Stress and Build Resilience, by Kim Colegrove. This book is read by Pam Ward. This book is dedicated to David M. Colegrove. Forward. Mindfulness for Warriors is an outstanding book I will be giving to a lot of people. My father was a Marine who came back from war and became a fireman. He saw hand-to-hand combat and was wounded by a sword on the Japanese island of Iwo Jima in World War II. Dad not only survived, he brought home the sword that nearly killed him. It was displayed proudly beside an American flag in our living room. My dad was a badass. So were first responders. I loved how brave Dad was, but I also sensed beneath his tough exterior he was hiding a lot of pain. He was a stoic who forged on without complaint, doing his very important work, but at a high personal cost. So many more like him serve our communities and deal with extreme stress on a daily basis, often without any relief or any way to process the pain and PTSD they are suffering. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a serious syndrome and can't be ignored. Tamping down those feelings for too long can lead to major consequences, as Kim Colegrove discovered with her husband's tragic suicide. Our first responders, police, military, firefighters, paramedics, hospital workers, dispatchers, and many more, do so much to help others. More often than not, they don't get around to helping themselves. In Mindfulness for Warriors, Colegrove provides marvelous tools, offering renewal for these courageous people who do so much for the rest of us. Kim Colegrove's book is an invaluable tool to help the helpers. Her mindfulness practices and meditation techniques offer much respite, relief, and calm to anyone who picks up this book. Becca Anderson, author of Prayers for Hard Times and Real-Life Mindfulness. Introduction. To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Here's how this whole thing started. Me, I want to teach cops how to meditate. Pretty much everyone else on the planet, you will never get cops to meditate. Me, hold my beer. The catalyst to this work was my husband's death by suicide in 2014. I never intended to become an advocate for culture evolution in law enforcement and other first responder professions, but here I am. Meditation and mindfulness are personal practices that empower an individual to become familiar with and regulate the self. They are evidence-based, meaning there's research to support my mission. When you learn these skills and practice them regularly, you can use them to settle and neutralize your system, mentally, physically, and emotionally. Nobody needs this information more than emergency responders. Police, firefighters, EMTs, paramedics, other EMS roles, dispatchers, corrections officers, active military, and veterans. And I'm also going to include social workers and other mental health professionals, clergy, ER professionals, and others in the mix. Although these would not technically fall under the heading of first responder, their experiences of stress, trauma, and secondary trauma mirror those of first responders. The technical definition of a first responder is a person designated or trained to respond to an emergency. Although we typically think of a police officer, firefighter, or paramedic, there are so many other professions that operate under the umbrella of the definition. I want to be inclusive, because I've learned that there are commonalities among all of these professions when it comes to the effects of stress and trauma. My challenge, and frankly the challenge of first responders, is breaking through the stoicism and stigma that pervade most of these professions. Traditionally, these cultures encourage first responders to stay quiet about emotional or mental distress. They learn early on that they are expected to accept the inevitability of organizational stress and dysfunction, debilitating stress symptoms, emotional upheaval, sleep disruption and disorders, marriage problems and divorce, and substance use and abuse. The coping mechanisms that are most often modeled and accepted in these cultures include excessive drinking, the use of prescription drugs, risky behavior, avoidance, and black humor, telling jokes and laughing about the shocking, disturbing, and gruesome things being experienced on the job. Makes sense, doesn't it? If a person isn't allowed to feel and show normal human emotions, at least the laughter provides some relief from the bottled-up pain, grief, sorrow, anger, fear, and despondency. Meditation and mindfulness are coping mechanisms that can help a person learn to modulate stress and emotion for the purpose of self-regulation. They require stillness and silence, and, yes, they require observation and feeling. But wait, there's more. These powerful personal practices can also empower a person to choose focus and intensity when needed, and de-escalation when desired. Can you imagine this level of self-discipline and relief? For those of you concerned that you'll lose your edge, please don't worry. I'm not asking you to sit down and meditate in the middle of a crisis. Rather, I'm suggesting that you use these tools between crises and train yourself to harness the power to defuse and de-stress when you need to or want to. Hypervigilance is a big problem in the first responder community. Yes, your senses need to be heightened at work, and your ability to focus and react is what makes you an excellent first responder. But you might not need the same level of intensity on every call or with every interaction, especially at home. The problem is, hypervigilance gets locked in, stresses your biological systems, and can hurt the people around you. Same with anger, hostility, aggression, defensiveness, negativity, and apathy. So, I'm asking first responders to set aside their preconceptions and skepticism and give me a chance, to give meditation and mindfulness a chance. The status quo is not working. Our first responders are stressed and traumatized, and they are dying at alarming rates, sometimes prematurely due to stress-related health problems, sometimes in line of duty deaths, and way too often by their own hand. What I present in my classes and in this book is an introduction to the concept of meditation and mindfulness as healing tools. I am offering a simple, straightforward, logical way for you to dip your big toe into the pool, so to speak. If, when you finish this book, meditation appeals to you on any level, but you are not connecting with my style of instruction, please don't give up. All it takes is a quick search of the internet to find other practices and techniques. I promise you can find something that works for you. Also, you should know, I am teaching cops to meditate, and they are loving it. In fact, I'm working with first responders from all professions, and they are embracing these once new agey, now mainstream practices with open arms. Well, they embrace them with open arms after begrudgingly sitting in class with their arms crossed in front of them for the first 30 minutes. I love the challenge. So, here we go. Uncross your arms and set those preconceptions aside. I have some things I'd like to share with you, because I really want you to live a long, healthy, happy life. You deserve it. Part 1. The Warrior. Chapter 1. From Widow to Warrior. Show me a hero and I'll write you a tragedy. F. Scott Fitzgerald. My husband dedicated 30 years of his life to a profession that trains warriors for battle, but has no context for healing the invisible wounds of warfare. Did the job kill my husband? No. Was it a contributor? Absolutely. Our first responders are very well trained, but their training does not prepare them for the mental and emotional impacts of the job. Invisible wounds. A majority of first responders suffer from symptoms of post-traumatic stress, which is a condition that develops in some people who encounter trauma. Trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience that alters a person's ability to cope. The average citizen has no idea what first responders see, hear, and endure throughout their careers. They are constantly exposed to and affected by the trauma of others. Accidents, disaster, violence, abuse, neglect, victimization, and death. This type of trauma is known as secondary trauma. First responders regularly encounter scenes and circumstances that most of us could not stomach. The sights, sounds, and smells from these experiences leave imprints on their psyches. Memories and images can continue to harm them after the event is over. And very often these invisible wounds do not heal on their own. Post-traumatic stress, PTS, and secondary trauma are not visible like a burn, a gunshot wound, or a laceration. They occur on the inside, unseen, but they cause just as much, if not more, pain. Left untreated, PTS and secondary trauma can be stealthy killers. They quietly ruin health, relationships, families, and lives. They can cause people to withdraw and isolate, or rage and lash out. They create devastation and rob individuals of the most basic human rights: life, love, and joy. However, they are treatable. But in order for treatment to become normalized, the shame and disgrace attached to seeking help must be eliminated. Stigma. There has long been a stigma attached to mental health issues in these often stoic emergency responder professions. If a person is brave or desperate enough to speak up about mental and emotional difficulties, they face the possibility of being labeled weak, unstable, or incompetent. Instead of receiving help, they might be demoted or fired. This ridiculous stigma causes first responders to suffer in silence, forced to pretend they're okay when they're not. This is what my husband did for years and years. In order to survive in the law enforcement culture, David felt he had to remain silent about anxiety, depression, and other symptoms he suffered over the years. He was terrified of being deemed incompetent or unsuitable for the job. He worried about being stripped of his badge and gun and being fired without the ability to support his family and collect the pension he had worked so hard to build. I want to make a point here about mental health and first responders, and I want to address first responders directly. Getting treatment for mental health does not mean you are mentally ill. I try to always include the word emotional when speaking about first responders who need help, because mental and emotional distress go hand in hand when they are caused by a stressful, traumatic profession. I say mental and emotional difficulties, or mental and emotional problems or issues. I think one of the main reasons you haven't sought or won't seek help is that you don't want people to think you're mentally ill or crazy. First of all, mental illness is not the same as being crazy, and everyone needs to knock it off with that kind of language and thinking. Secondly, mental illness is treatable, is not necessarily permanent, and should never be stigmatized. So listen up. You have been mentally and emotionally wounded. This should not cause shame any more than a physical wound would. If you are struggling mentally and emotionally because of the work you do and the things you've seen, you have been wounded. You are not weak. You are human. And let me be blunt. If you are resistant to help and treatment because of the stigma, you are sacrificing your life to your job, and that is unacceptable. Someday you will leave this job one way or another, and when you do, what will your life look like? How is your mental, emotional, and physical health? What about your personal life, your relationships, and your social life? Are you happy, healthy, and thriving? Or do you operate in some version of survival mode, putting one foot in front of the other in a joyless existence? I've met a lot of veteran and retired first responders who have been divorced more than once, drink too much, suffer from chronic health problems, and have adult children who won't speak to them. So, if your plan is to give everything to your job and then be happy when you retire, consider this. When you retire, assuming you live that long, all the garbage that you've stuffed down and held in will still be there. It doesn't magically disappear. It rots and festers. And the day after you retire, the job goes on as if you never existed. Which means the job is just fine, whether you're there or not. Are you willing to give everything to a job that will not miss a beat when you leave? And now, I want to address leaders and commanders. It is imperative that you immediately initiate and execute policies to end this stigma. This is a top-down situation that can only be fixed by the people at the top showing real leadership and compassion. Old-fashioned, outdated thinking must be tossed out the window. It's time for the old guard, suck-it-up leaders to retire and step aside if they are unwilling to embrace empathy and understanding. If I hear about one more boss saying they don't believe in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, I think I will likely explode. If this is your mindset, it is time for you to hang it up, madam or sir. The world has passed you by. And not only are you standing in the way of progress, but your misinformed and misguided rhetoric and decisions are killing people. Ripple effects. I would be remiss in speaking to first responders and commanders if I didn't address the ripple effects that occur when someone does make the choice to end their own life. I've heard from people who have considered suicide, and some who have even attempted it, that at the point of choice, they believed everyone in their lives would be better off without them. Somehow, in the midst of feeling like they're drowning in pain, fear, anxiety, depression, and despair, people who are suicidal rationalize that death is the only answer, the only relief. I'm sure there are many different versions of this, but as I understand it, it goes something like this. I am a mess. I am so tired of feeling like this. Nothing helps. I have become a burden to my friends and family, and everyone will be better off with me gone. They'll all be fine eventually, and my suffering will end. This is just for the best. Well, this is hard for most of us to understand. I believe some people reach a point where they have lost all memory of what it's like to feel okay. And they are so exhausted from suffering that they convince themselves death is their only path to peace and freedom. If you have considered or are considering suicide, I'd like to share with you some of the ripple effects that occurred and continue because of my husband's choice to end his life. The truth is, every person who knew David was negatively impacted in some way. Nobody is better off without him. Not one of us. David has parents and 2 sisters who miss him. He has children and stepchildren who miss him, and will forever carry heaviness, regret, and pain regarding his choice. He has friends who were shocked, stunned, saddened, and confused by this tragedy. He had a nephew named Nico, with whom he was especially close. David taught Nico how to fish and use tools. They bonded over guy stuff, bad jokes, dumb movies, and Just Dance on the Wii, which was the most hilarious thing you've ever seen. Nico struggled with some emotional difficulties in adolescence, and Uncle David was someone he could always talk to. When he found out his uncle had killed himself, he was devastated. We worried about Nico a lot in the days, weeks, and months following David's funeral. Nico made the trip from St. Louis to Kansas City several times in those days to spend time with us. I think being in his uncle's home was comforting somehow. Nico and I were close, and he was close with my kids, especially my son. On an early Sunday morning in June of 2015, after Nico had spent the night at my house, I talked to him over coffee. I told him I knew he missed his uncle, and that I understood he had been experiencing a rough patch in life. I assured him that I would always be there for him, and that he was welcome at our house anytime. And then I mustered the courage to say what I really wanted to say, which was, I need to know you're never going to consider killing yourself. I know life gets hard, but you have so many people who love you, and this family cannot take another tragedy. Nico looked me right in the eye and said, I've seen how much David's death has hurt everyone, and I would never consider doing that to my family. I was so relieved. On July 2nd, 2015, 7 months after David ended his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, Nico Hundelt did the exact same thing. He was 20 years old. Also, on that day, David's best friend in the whole world, his sister Julie, had to face the devastating reality that she had lost her brother and closest friend, as well as her youngest child, in the span of less than a year. The ripples continue. Nico has a mom and a dad who miss him terribly and will never stop grieving. He has 2 brothers who loved him so much, and have to face each day knowing their little brother is gone forever. He had a girlfriend when he died. He had more friends than you could count, and at least a couple of them have since experienced their own darkness, depression, and even suicidal ideation. Did you know that suicide can be contagious? There is something called suicide contagion. It's a phenomenon that occurs in families and peer groups. Basically, exposure to suicide has been shown to increase one's potential to consider suicide. After Nico's death, the entire family went into a tailspin of emotional and mental anguish and paranoid vigilance. Some family members struggled more than others, and we found ourselves terrified that whoever was not doing well at any given time would be the next one to kill themselves. And I'd be lying if I told you we've stopped worrying about that. Every one of us has indelible and unshakable memories of how and when we found out about each of these deaths. And now many of us are triggered by the simplest things, like late-night phone calls, calls from a family member at an unusual time, or a knock at the door. We were each shocked, stunned, and devastated by the deaths of these men we loved so much. So, if you are someone who is considering suicide, know this. If you choose suicide, and you have children, you have just modeled for them that suicide is an option when life gets hard. When those children encounter dark times in life and they are searching for answers, help, and relief, they are much more likely to consider suicide. Is that the legacy you want to leave behind? And it's not just your kids you might unwittingly be giving permission. Friends, family members, and colleagues might also be more likely to follow suit. Suicide does not end suffering. It simply passes suffering on to others. Silent suffering. David was a police officer for 8 years, from age 21 to 29. And then he joined a federal agency and worked as a special agent and a SAC, special agent in charge, for 22 years. I believe most of his buried trauma occurred during the 8 years he was on patrol. In my travels with the Pause First project, I've met many people who worked with David over the years. They have all been generous in their praise of his police work and investigative skills. My husband was good at his job, but he was not built for the job. Since his death, I have learned that nobody is. Not really. Humans are not built to endure and withstand years and years of intense stress, trauma, death, and devastation. Yes, there are people who can do the work and do it well, but nobody goes unscathed. David was a sweet, sensitive, emotional man at his core. The dysfunction, death, and violence he witnessed as a police officer affected him deeply and subsequently impacted his entire life. In a later segment in this book, titled His Buried Trauma, I will talk more about what David endured during his 8 years as a patrolman. Those early years caused indelible pain and trauma that I believe changed the trajectory of my husband's life. In my opinion, had David been able to seek assistance for the mental and emotional fallout from the early days on the job, he would have been a more effective law enforcement officer and investigator. And he was pretty damn good as it was. He also could have enjoyed a more peaceful, personal life. And he might still be here. Instead, he struggled and suffered off and on for the entire 30 years. And his suffering caused pain for the people he loved. With knowledge of the stigma surrounding mental and emotional problems in law enforcement so deeply buried in his psyche, instead of seeking help, David became engulfed in a tsunami of trauma symptoms and ultimately decided death was the only way to escape the pain. It did not have to be this way. And it doesn't have to end like this for one other first responder. If any of this resonates with you, if you are a first responder who has suffered similarly, please know there is hope. There is help available. You can heal. You can learn skills and tools to build your resilience and survive, no matter how bad things are. If you are someone who loves a first responder, and you suspect your loved one is struggling like David did, please know there are first responder-specific programs and facilities that can help. That is the one piece we were missing near the end of David's life. We did not know that type of help was available. We tried the normal psychiatric route, but that was never going to help my husband, because there was no way he was letting his guard down in that environment. Later in the book, I will offer stories of first responders from all backgrounds: military, law enforcement, fire service, EMS, and dispatch, who at some point in their career found themselves struggling or suffering with post-traumatic stress symptoms, trauma, anxiety, depression, nightmares, recurring memories and images, and even suicidal ideation. They will tell us where they've been, what they experienced, and how it affected them, their families, and their lives. Then they will share how they found the courage to step onto a healing path, which tools worked for them, and what they are doing to maintain their well-being. Maybe you will see yourself in one of these people. Perhaps their story is your story. If so, my hope is that hearing from these brave and vulnerable souls will create a spark in you and inspire you to take that first step toward wellness and wholeness. Reach out, talk to someone, attend a peer support meeting, or make your first counseling appointment. Learn what helped these people, and maybe try something they tried. But please know that you are not alone. Others have struggled in the same way you are, but they've survived and are thriving, and you can too. We must put an end to silent suffering. We are losing too many first responders to suicide and premature death due to health problems. First responders deserve a long, full, peaceful, happy, healthy life. They deserve to have connected relationships and a culture and community that supports them. My initiation. Becoming a widow was my initiation as a warrior. I am fighting for first responders and their families. There is a massive nationwide movement to bring healing to our first responders, and I have joined this cause. I'm standing shoulder to shoulder with an army of compassionate, caring people who will stop at nothing to help, save, and rescue the brave and important people who have dedicated their lives to helping, saving, and rescuing others. Each of us contributes something unique to the fight, but all of us are united in the commitment to bring sweeping change to this dire situation. This is not a moment. It's a movement. It's not a wellness fad that will fade away like a trendy diet or the latest health guru. This is a new way of being for first responders, and it will prevail and sustain. My small part in this movement is to offer two powerful personal practices to first responders and their families and loved ones. The practices are meditation and mindfulness. These tools help turn one's attention inward, to the self. They can help a person manage stress, regulate emotions, and improve overall health. Beyond teaching meditation and mindfulness, I am encouraging first responders to seek professional help and step onto a healing path that can change the trajectory of their lives and the lives of everyone they love. There are many, many other people, other warriors involved in this movement who are offering myriad tools, therapies, retreats, modalities, education, facilities, books, counseling, peer groups, training, and other forms of support. Together, we will make a difference. If you are a first responder, please join the movement to help and heal, starting with yourself. Up until now, you have been the help. Now, maybe you need a little help. Please don't allow your stoicism, shame, embarrassment, or pride to keep you from seeking the help and support you need and deserve. Chapter 2. What is a warrior? Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. Plato. Here is the most basic, historical definition of a warrior: a person who fights in a battle or war. Here's my definition. A warrior is anyone who stands ready to serve, protect, and defend a person, place, thing, or cause, and will fight and sacrifice for the betterment of others and for the greater good. My husband David was a warrior. He was a protector and a guardian of justice. He had this way of making people feel safe. Once, in marriage counseling, our therapist said, "If the ship is going down, stand next to David and you will survive." That about sums it up. That's who David was at his core. David was a good man, and he was a good cop, by all accounts. In the year of his death, he received 2 prominent awards: the State of Missouri Guardian of Justice Award and an MOCIC, Mid-States Organized Crime Information Center, Award. In the 1990s, while working as a federal agent, David headed up a 2-year-long investigation which led to the arrest and conviction of a crime ring, including a brutal killer who was featured on the TV show America's Most Wanted. And he had many other career successes and accolades. Recently, I was speaking at a law enforcement conference, and I saw a man making a beeline toward me from across the room. As he approached, I thought his eyes looked teary. He stretched out his hand and said, "I worked with your husband many years ago. I hadn't heard that he had passed. I'm so sorry." I thanked him, and we chatted a little. His comments about David echoed what many others have said to me over the years. "Your husband was a really good cop," he said. "If shit was going down, you wanted David there with you." I always say David was this great combination of a silly, funny, goofy guy who you probably wouldn't want to encounter in a dark alley. He was charming and harmless, until he or someone he felt responsible for was threatened, and then watch out. He could switch to warrior mode in a split second. The problem is, warring takes a toll on the warrior, and our Western society is not good about taking care of these brave and noble individuals. I've heard that, in ancient times, indigenous people went to great lengths to care for their warriors. When warriors returned home from battle, they were welcomed, honored, and praised. They were given time to reflect and rest and heal. They were tended to and held in high regard. This makes sense to me, considering they put their lives on the line, ensuring that others' lives were protected. The Gladiator. I have a vivid memory of watching the movie Gladiator, starring Russell Crowe, with my husband one night. It was a movie David would watch over and over. I now understand why he was drawn to that story. He identified with the main character. Not in a dreamy, wishful way. He literally possessed the traits of the gladiator. But he would never have admitted that because he was also humble. The movie is about a principled man and revered Roman general who seeks revenge against a corrupt emperor who ordered the murder of the general's family, captured and enslaved him, and forced him to fight in the gladiator arena. During a particularly brutal fight scene, I said something to my husband like, "I hate watching this violent stuff. I hate war. I hate fighting. It's just not my thing." David paused the movie, looked at me, and replied, "Well, you better be glad there are people willing to get into the arena and fight." I said, "I know. You're right. And I am grateful for that." He was absolutely right, and he wasn't just referring to the movie or the gladiator arena. My off-the-cuff comment triggered something in him about people who abhor violence and have dreams of a peaceful world. I realize, looking back, that in his role as a law enforcement officer, David did not seek out conflict or violence. It was thrust upon him. Just a few weeks after David died, I watched Gladiator by myself. I probably cried more watching that movie than I cried at David's funeral. My husband embodied all the qualities of Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the north, general of the Felix legions, and loyal servant to the true emperor, Marcus Aurelius. David was principled, brave, determined, loyal, and protective, especially if he loved you. He understood that doing a job well meant sacrifice. He took pride in everything he did. You could count on him. You felt safe with him. He identified with that movie because he was a gladiator. He didn't want to fight, but if you threw him into the arena, he would survive. Maximus quickly became a leader to the other slaves in the arena and used his instincts and ability not only to save himself, but to keep the other slaves alive as well. That was how David lived his life, with a high degree of honor and sense of responsibility. A warrior is a gladiator, a fighter, a protector, and a hero. Their innate instinct to survive and save others far surpasses what the rest of us possess. Keep fighting. If your life or work involves helping, saving, and rescuing others in any capacity, large or small, you are a warrior. If you are someone who stands ready to serve, protect, and defend a person, place, thing, or cause, and will fight and sacrifice for the betterment of others and for the greater good, you are a warrior. You are a warrior. I am the wife of a warrior, now a widow and a warrior myself. We've been thrown into the arena, and we need to keep fighting, all of us, for ourselves, our well-being, and our families, for others, and for the greater good. Chapter 3. Death Notification. The Saturday after Thanksgiving in 2014 was unseasonably warm in Kansas City. My 13-year-old daughter and I took advantage of the nice weather and hung some Christmas lights on our front porch. Then I drove her to a friend's house for a sleepover. When I got back home, I started making dinner. As I stirred a pot on my stove, I heard a knock. I walked toward the front door, and as I got closer, I could see a uniformed officer standing on my porch. A feeling I cannot put into words flooded my entire system. And as I type, the feeling returns. I opened the door and the officer began to speak. It's impossible to explain the shock and paralyzing emotion that engulfed me in the next few seconds. My husband had been found in his truck in the back of our neighborhood with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his head. He was gone. The next few hours, days, weeks, and months are a blurry mess in my memory. My husband chose a permanent solution to a temporary problem, and in the process created untold waves of pain and trauma. Like everyone else who's ever grieved, I swirled around in a vortex of sadness, anger, fear, regret, resentment, nostalgia, love, longing, confusion, and finally acceptance, after a long, long time. The distance, time, and space between me and that life-altering day in 2014 eventually gave rise to something new. I began to think about that incident in a new way, from a different perspective. It started with something I remembered the police officer saying in my doorway. He mentioned that an off-duty firefighter was the one who heard the shot, found my husband, and called 911. At the time, I think I had a fleeting sense of relief that it was a first responder and not a neighborhood kid who found him. Next, my mind began to wander from person to person who might have been involved in that horrific call that day. Besides the caller, there would have been a dispatcher. What a terrible call to receive. Then there would have been all of the others who were dispatched to the scene and had to see it, work it, keep citizens away, and participate in the cleanup. And, finally, the coroner. It was extremely difficult for me to allow myself to picture the scene at all, let alone picturing it in such vivid detail. But there was something inside me trying to get my attention. It was nudging me toward the proper empathy and compassion for not only the individuals who had to work the scene of a suicide that day, but all of the people who do this kind of work every day. I realized it must have been awful for the officer who came to my house and the detective who accompanied him and had to give me all the pertinent information in a matter-of-fact way while he watched me melting and dissolving into a puddle of grief right before his eyes. Oh, my God. My husband had done this work. Dots started connecting in my head and heart. Prior to becoming a federal investigator, David was a police officer for 8 years. He went on horrific calls and processed gruesome crime scenes. He knocked on doors and told mothers their child had died. He saw death and violence, devastation and destruction. And he witnessed things so heinous, he wouldn't speak of them. This realization started slowly and gained momentum steadily. The more I thought about it, the more shocked I was that this had never occurred to me before. Of course, police work had contributed to my husband's overall mental and emotional health issues. Of course, he carried invisible wounds and trauma that impacted his worldview and affected every aspect of his well-being. Of course, they all do. All first responders have invisible wounds. They see, hear, and endure things that most of us can't even imagine. They carry a weight that would be unbearable for the average citizen, and because of this, they are dying younger, and, in some cases, choosing to end their own lives. So if there's something I can do to help other first responders manage their stress and find a bit of relief from this taxing and traumatic way of life, I want to do it. I have to do it. As a tribute to my husband and a thank you to these great people, I must do what I can to help. Part 2. The Weight. Chapter 4. His buried trauma. The effects of accumulated stress and trauma. Since David's suicide, I've learned a lot about trauma and secondary trauma, and how they can permeate and affect every aspect of a person's life. My husband carried a tremendous amount of trauma that had roots in his early years, grew exponentially throughout his police career, and affected all areas of his life. The impacts of trauma. Trauma occurs when a person experiences or witnesses abuse, victimization, neglect, loss, violence, and disasters. The term secondary trauma refers to exposure to the trauma of others. Unfortunately, the majority of first responders experience some kind of trauma during their career, and it can be toxic to them, mentally and emotionally. To make things worse, many first responders are carrying around trauma they incurred prior to embarking on their career. This is certainly true in David's case. And I want to share with you a couple of experiences he had early on that I believe initiated, or at least contributed to, his lifelong struggle with anxiety and depression. Age 16. When David was only 16 years old, he and 3 friends were in a car on a country road. David was seated in the back seat, behind the passenger. The driver lost control of the car and started to veer off the road. There was a downed telephone pole on the side of the road. David saw it and ducked as the pole crashed through the windshield, decapitating his friend sitting in front of him. David was not injured. As David recounted this story, what struck me was the fact that the 3 surviving boys received no counseling of any kind. Of course, this would have been around 1980, a time in which counseling and therapy were not ubiquitous as they are now. However, I suspect this traumatizing experience did more damage to David emotionally and psychologically than anyone knew. He definitely had survivor's guilt, often wondering why he was able to avoid the pole, but his friend wasn't. Age 21. In my husband's first year of policing, when he was only 21 years old, he was involved in a shootout that began with him being shot at, which resulted in his killing the shooter. Afterwards, he was called into the police station, where his badge and gun were taken away and he was sent home. David spent the next several days in an apartment, alone, afraid, and isolated, not knowing what was going to happen to him. Then he got a call telling him that the incident had been ruled suicide by police, and he had been cleared. They told him to report for roll call the next day. When he returned, he was given his badge and gun, went to roll call, and climbed back into a patrol car. And that was that. Back to work. No counseling, no conversation, no debrief, and no support of any kind. When I think of all the trauma this incident caused, it makes my heart heavy. For starters, he was only 21. I can't imagine the trauma of being shot at, fearing for your life, and then ultimately taking someone else's life. I know this incident haunted him because whenever he talked about it, which was rare, he would become extremely emotional. He could never reconcile in his head and heart taking the life of another human being, and he lived with that guilt until the day he died. The cost of untreated trauma. If nothing else upsetting had ever occurred in David's life, these two incidents alone would be enough to cause distress. But that wasn't the case. David encountered a tremendous amount of stress and trauma in his lifetime, and much of it was concentrated in the 8 years he served as a police officer. As a federal agent for the final 22 years of his career, he worked some difficult cases and encountered challenges, but nothing like those 8 years in a patrol car. Those years were brutal. Yet he never sought, nor did he receive, proper treatment. Throughout David's career, the untreated and unprocessed trauma caused him to experience recurring symptoms, which he was intermittently able to numb, typically with alcohol. He battled with anxiety and depression off and on, and he suffered from recurring dreams and nightmares. In his dreams, there were 3 consistent themes. He was in a police station. He felt a sense of being lost or in the wrong place, and he often needed to discharge his weapon but could not. He would even wake up with a sore hand from squeezing it tightly and repeatedly in his sleep. Over time, accumulated stress and trauma grew so overwhelming and so powerful that it infiltrated David's personality, turning an otherwise great guy into an angry, paranoid, cynical character, or an emotional wreck who could not stop crying. These stress-induced symptoms ultimately left my husband unable to cope with change, uncertainty, or the most basic daily challenges. As he approached retirement, I believe all the unprocessed pain, fear, anxiety, and depression that he had contained over the years began creeping up and oozing into every crack and crevice, flooding and engulfing him mercilessly. He began taking an antidepressant. That didn't help. He added an anti-anxiety drug. That didn't help. He drank. That didn't help. He kept himself busy. That didn't help. And that had always helped. The dark side of the light of my life. It has taken me a long time to summon the courage to speak honestly about my husband, his issues, and our struggles. David was a very proud and private man, so telling his secrets feels like a betrayal of sorts. I don't want to let strangers into the dark corners of our life together. I'd much rather talk about the good times, and there were plenty of those. Anyone who knew us knew that we loved each other deeply and shared an intimate friendship that I may never know again. But toward the end of his life, when he was unraveling, that changed. And he turned on me. My sweet, loving husband became someone I hardly recognized and could rarely reason with. He vacillated between despair, anger, bouts of crying, and hostility. He said and did things that were out of character and extremely hurtful. And he made some choices he would never have made in his right mind. The last few months of his life were like the scariest roller coaster you can imagine, with hairpin turns, inversions, barrel rolls, negative G's, no brakes, and no seatbelts. The man I had known to be as solid as a rock was up and down and all over the place, unpredictable and inconsistent in every way. What I now know, having interacted with a lot of first responders and their spouses, is that a high percentage of spouses experience the roller coaster at some point in their relationship. if not throughout. It's terrifying to be on the receiving end of that kind of whiplash, especially if you are trying to keep a marriage and family together. The truth is, throughout our marriage, there was a dark side to David that cast a shadow on our otherwise sunny life, like a murky figure lurking in the background. When he got emotionally triggered by anger or felt threatened in any way, this dark figure would step out of the shadows and take over. This happened rarely, but when it did, it was intense. That dark eye was never violent toward me, but he was angry and hateful and completely out of control. After each episode had subsided, David was embarrassed, ashamed, and apologetic. And even though these episodes were awful, I felt so sorry for my husband because it was clear he was full of pain. I believe this dark alter ego developed as a result of years of unresolved trauma and suffering. In the last days, there was very little left of the David I had known and loved. His eyes were vacant, and his personality was totally altered. On the day he died, however, he left me with a gift. As we were passing each other in our bedroom, he reached out and stopped me. He stood in front of me, placed his hands on my shoulders, stared right into my eyes, and said, "I love you." I replied with an exasperated, "I love you too, David." But then I looked into his eyes and I saw something I hadn't seen for months. Clarity. He did not let go of me as he went on, "I love you, honey. I really love you. I need you to know that I love you." "I love you too," I replied again, and I put my arms around him. We hugged for a long time in silence. That was the first lucidity I had witnessed in a long time, and our last embrace. My message to spouses. In my early days of teaching first responders, a firefighter gave me one of the best gifts ever. After class, he caught me in the hall and we had a brief private chat. He thanked me for my work and extended his condolences for the loss of my husband. Then he said something important. He told me very kindly that he detected a lack of confidence in my delivery and referred back to some comments I had made like, "Now I know I'm not a first responder and can never really understand what you've experienced." Then he looked at me and said, "You are a first responder. You were married to one of us, and that makes you one of us." He went on to say, "This is what I tell my wife, and I mean it. It is not easy being married to someone who does this work. And I know sometimes you guys take the brunt of the stress. So," he said, "don't ever diminish yourself. You are one of us." That was a real confidence booster, and a bit of validation I didn't even realize I needed. Most first responders avoid telling their spouses about the horrific things they see at work as a way to shield and protect them. But, ironically, holding these stories in causes the emotional damage to accumulate. A human being can only hold a certain amount of stress, anger, trauma, sadness, fear, and depression before the unbearable pressure demands release. Unfortunately, they usually release it on the people closest to them. And this is most often their spouse, and sometimes their children. If you're married to a first responder who is struggling, you are most likely not doing well yourself, and you probably have no idea what to do. It is scary to see the person you love or once loved unravel, withdraw, and rage. One of the hardest parts of a relationship like this is the helplessness we feel that we can't fix, save, or rescue them. I'm not qualified to guide or counsel anyone, but I will encourage you to reach out for the help that is available until you find the right fit. Seek out first responder-specific programs and trauma-informed care therapists. Take care of yourself and your children. And if there is domestic violence involved, take immediate steps to get and keep everyone safe, no matter what it takes. Whatever you do, please don't continue to live in pain and dysfunction. First responders aren't the only ones who sometimes suffer in silence. Spouses are susceptible to all the same issues. If you are suffering, you can be guaranteed your children are suffering also. Please reach out. Find a peer support group. Talk to other spouses. Try counseling. Anything that might help to heal the situation. The vulnerability paradox. I observed and endured a lot of dysfunction as a result of my husband's unresolved trauma. This is extremely difficult for me to admit, because I feel vulnerable exposing the underbelly of my imperfect private life. I guess I'm afraid of being judged. As I identify this feeling of vulnerability within myself, I realize this is the very fear that gripped my husband and kept him from seeking the help he needed. I have deep compassion for this man who, in order to survive and thrive in the law enforcement culture, felt he could not afford to be vulnerable. That's the tangled web, isn't it? First responders are hurting or scared, but they want people to think they're okay. If they are honest about their struggles, if they say they need help, others might think they are weak or broken or crazy. Not to mention the fact that they could face demotion or dismissal from their jobs. So they stay quiet, and they suffer. The deeper I got into my work with first responders, the more I realized how important it is for me to let my guard down and speak the truth about my husband's problems and our mostly awesome, but sometimes awful, life together. There are too many people suffering in silence and way too many people dying. I hope that David's story, our story, will shine a light on this reality so others won't have to endure the same pain and tragedy. The unraveling. In the year leading up to my husband's death, his mental health became increasingly worse. His decision to retire after 30 years triggered a surge of anxiety, and although he had spent 2 years carefully crafting a new business venture with a partner, David was terrified of the uncertainty of civilian life and wallowed in thoughts about worst-case scenarios. In hindsight, there were all kinds of warning signs during that year. David's anxiety intensified, and the episodes, which were almost always alcohol-induced, became more frequent. The dark guy surfaced more often and brought with him fear, worry, angst, paranoia, and irrational behavior. David's last day at work was Friday, September 5th, 2014. On Saturday, we had his retirement party. On Sunday, he had a full-blown anxiety attack, and by the following week, his anxiety sent him to the emergency room. This kicked off 2 months of intense inpatient and outpatient treatment, and the slew of prescription medications did not help. In fact, they made things worse. He barely made it through Thanksgiving dinner because the anxiety was so intense that he could not sit still or focus or even carry on a normal conversation. 2 days later, David killed himself. Hindsight. I wish I had known then what I know now about the impacts of trauma and the specialized help that's available. My biggest regret is that I was not aware of any first responder-specific treatment programs. Many of them have sprung up in the years since David's death, and the ones that existed just never showed up on my radar. I searched and researched, but I didn't have the awareness I do today, so I wasn't looking in the right places. David was admitted to psychiatric care via the emergency room and participated in both inpatient and outpatient programs. He did not feel like this was the right care for him. I remember him saying, "I'm sitting in a circle with drug addicts, talking about their addictions. This is not helping me. This is not what I need." Now that I'm aware of first responder-specific facilities and treatment programs, and the trauma-informed care approach, I agree. He was absolutely right. The care he received was not the care he needed. Chapter 5. Darkness to Light. First responders share stories of difficult times and how they are healing. The power of storytelling. I've been working exclusively with first responders since 2017, and I've noticed some patterns and commonalities that I feel are important to note. In each talk I deliver, and every class I teach, certain attendees approach me to chat during breaks or after the conclusion of my presentation. A high percentage of people who want to talk to me are on the older side, typically over the age of 40. They are veterans in their field. They've been there and done that. And something about my story causes something in them to stir. Some of them see themselves in David's story. Others are beginning to think about retirement and are feeling the fear, worry, and anxiety creep in. Still others simply identify me as a safe person to whom they can tell their tale. So I listen with my ears and my heart, because I am honored that they trust me with their story. A few months ago, when I was on the road, I was conducting an in-service training for a large group of primarily law enforcement officers. During the class, I noticed several times that a small group of people sitting together near the back of the room weren't taking the training seriously. They looked to be about 25 to 30 in age, and they chatted a lot among themselves and were basically just screwing around. Conversely, there were several individuals in the front rows who seemed to be taking the class very seriously. They were older, I would guess in the 45 to 65 age range. A couple of times during my presentation, especially when I was talking about David and the impact of accumulated stress, I noticed a few of them were teary-eyed. As I observed this and made mental notes about the glaringly different response coming from the goofballs in the back, I had an aha moment. It occurred to me that the younger ones weren't as engaged because they didn't think they needed this stress reduction stuff. They're young. They've only been on the job for a couple of years and they still feel invincible. They haven't clocked the hours, haven't logged the miles. Their resilience hasn't been depleted. But the veteran people, the cops with a lot of years under their belts, they were listening. They were leaning in and taking notes. They saw themselves in David's story when I spoke of the trauma he had endured and how he carried it, unprocessed and unhealed, for decades. I suspect that somewhere deep inside they know that they too will be vulnerable to mental and emotional unraveling at retirement if they don't do something to lessen the psychological burdens they carry. Even if the young people don't think they need classes and stress reduction tools now, I know I'm planting seeds. I know that someday the goofballs in the back will be the veterans in the front. Hopefully, as they navigate their careers, the seeds will take root. And when they begin to feel the weight of the job, they will remember my class and David's story. And instead of allowing things to pile up, they will reach out for help or seek a healing path. My experience with the young goofballs and the teary veterans served as a reminder that David's story is important and needs to be told. In fact, I believe that the sharing of stories in an honest and vulnerable way will be the single most important catalyst for change. That's why I wanted to write this book and share the stories of some of the brave and vulnerable first responders I've met through my work. These people have worked in service to community and country. They have seen, heard, witnessed, and endured things that most of us can't even imagine. They carry burdens and images and memories that they can't fully unload, can't completely erase. I have the utmost respect for this group of people, and I consider them to be the bravest of the brave because they have chosen to tell their stories. It takes grit and guts, to be honest, to put oneself out there and admit to frailties and vulnerabilities. The level of courage it takes to speak up in a profession that prides itself on silence and stoicism is commendable. Let's discuss how their strength and willingness toward vulnerability is inspiring others and changing cultures. I've noticed that when one person is courageous enough to speak the truth about their struggles and pain, they create an opening for the next person to speak up. It's like the courage is contagious. Suddenly, someone else who has kept their suffering bottled up feels safe enough to share their experiences and feelings because they no longer feel alone. This causes a chain reaction of sharing, caring, support, and community that serves to heal the invisible wounds. When one person steps forward and says, "I'm hurting," it paves the way for others to step forward as well. People need to be seen, valued, and validated. I believe this is human nature, not a flaw or a weakness. When courageous people share what has happened to them and how it is affecting them, others feel safe to say they are hurting too. If everyone remains silent, then everyone thinks everyone else is doing okay but them. This deepens the feelings of shame and the fear that they will be seen as weak, and this nonsense is killing people. Verbally sharing lived experience of trauma can be cathartic and healing for both the speaker and the listener. So, without further ado, let's meet the first responders. I sat down with some veteran first responders and asked them the following 5 questions. 1, what is your background? 2, can you share a little about some of the difficult experiences you've endured? 3, was there a turning point? 4, which tools have you found most useful on your journey? 5, what needs to change in these cultures to support well-being? Sometimes we stuck to the script. Other times our conversations veered off course, but in every single instance, the answers were profound. Here's what they had to say. Justin. Military. United States Army Infantryman, 25th Infantry Division, 1st SBCT, Stryker Brigade Combat Team. One tour in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2004 to 2005. I got connected with Justin because of my work with the Pause First project and his work with The Battle Within, a 5-day retreat in nature for veterans and first responders. Our first meeting was in a coffee shop in early 2019. I learned all about The Battle Within, how the organization came to be, and how Justin became involved. I loved everything I heard. Justin is smart and articulate and has a personality that puts you at ease. I knew right off the bat he was someone I would love to work with, so I was thrilled when he reached out a few months later and invited me to lead mindfulness and meditation sessions at the Battle Within retreats. I am enjoying that work immensely, and I get to spend time with some pretty awesome people when I'm there. I sat down with Justin in my living room and asked him about his time in Iraq. I wasn't prepared for what he was about to share. The realities of war are shocking, and Justin was only 20 years old when he deployed. Difficult experiences. In Tal Athar, Iraq, Justin's company was charged with guarding the last standing police station in the area. During this time, 2 of the Iraqi police officers were captured, tortured, killed, and left out on the street. The other cops were, understandably, extremely upset by this. The U.S. soldiers pleaded with the men to wait for EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, to come clear the bodies, because insurgents would often hide explosives on dead bodies. The police officers refused to listen. 2 of them went to retrieve the bodies, and explosives embedded within the bodies killed them both. After this incident, the other police officers were in the police station, drinking heavily. All of them were armed, which was clearly not a good situation. Plus, there was a lot of unspoken tension between the police and the infantrymen. At some point, one of the police officers left, unbeknownst to the U.S. soldiers charged with defending them. The officer walked unnoticed into the marketplace and opened fire on civilians. Luckily, the U.S. soldiers were able to stop the man and arrest him. Later that day, Justin's team went to the local hospital for some kind of meeting. As he walked down the hall, he noticed a young girl on a gurney in the hallway by herself. She had been injured in the marketplace shooting. She was gray. He assumed she was dead. At this point in our conversation, Justin provided a sidebar. He told me that by this time in his tour, he was closed off emotionally. He said in order to survive over there, you pretty much had to turn off your feelings and emotions. As he walked by the girl on the gurney, he noticed that her chest was moving just a bit. She was still alive, but just barely. He kept walking, and later he learned that the girl had died. As a matter of survival in a war zone, soldiers are forced to shut off their emotions and stay focused on the business at hand. I got the impression, talking to Justin, that the decision to keep walking as he passed the dying girl wasn't a conscious one. It was the order of the day. Stay sharp, keep going, take care of your own, and survive. While he was deployed in Iraq, Justin's vehicle was impacted by 22 separate incidents of IEDs, improvised explosive devices, a car bomb, and a suicide car bomb. He suffered a TBI, traumatic brain injury, along with other non-life-threatening injuries. He was once trapped in an alley with one other soldier and an Iraqi interpreter when an Iraqi soldier opened fire. The 3 were pinned down, exchanging gunfire, and a bullet grazed Justin's temple. As the RTO, radio telephone operator, Justin was able to call for reinforcements to gain fire superiority, and all 3 made it out alive. Later, a doctor told Justin that had the bullet struck a half-inch over, he would have been dead. Justin was awarded 2 Purple Hearts. He lost people in his company while fighting in Iraq, and has since lost several more to suicide.